Hi there, everyone. My name is Sai, and I wanted to introduce you to the first episode of the Crypto Guardians podcast, where we talk about the people growing and keeping our ecosystem in Web3 safe. As a disclaimer, this is not advice. This is not crypto advice, not financial advice, life advice, or advice of any other kind. Um, that being said, wanted to introduce our first guest and really the person that inspired me to start this podcast and start my whole experience in crypto. Arjun has been a neighbor of mine. We were living in San Francisco together. We played basketball. It probably actually taught me how to play basketball. And on the courts, we had deep and ongoing discussions of crypto, security, blockchain, and the intersection of all three of those spaces and how they come together. So Arjun, thank you so much for joining me. And just by way of introduction, I'd love for you to tell the folks about yourself and how you got into the space.
Thanks so much, Sai. That's a very, very tall order to live up to. Not in just in so many ways. Basketball, crypto. I'll take all the credit though.
I learned everything from you, man.
All right. So how did I get into this space? The space that we're talking about is crypto. In about 2013, I read the Bitcoin white paper. Like everybody else, my journey into the space started with the Bitcoin white paper. I found it very interesting. I found it to be engineering that I understood, although at that point, very naively, I did not know how applicable it was. Right, that has significantly changed now, but at that point, I was interested in it purely from an engineering perspective. I thought it was excellent engineering. There was complex engineering, and it's engineering that intrigued me. So that's how I got into it. So after I read the paper, after I consumed this sparse reading material about it, the first thing I did was I decided for me to get hands-on with Bitcoin, I wanted to start mining Bitcoin. Yeah, not at that point, not from a financial perspective, obviously. At that point, purely from a learning perspective. And the thing that played to my favor was we were living in New York City, and our rent included our electricity. So
Much to their folly.
much to their folly, I guess. So we didn't have to pay pay for electricity separately. It was just a flat rent, right? So what I did was I went to eBay. I bought some old previous generation ASICs, right? Like people who have been in the world, they will recognize Antminers, right? I think Antminer S1 was the first ASIC I bought, which is basically the one of the oldest ASICs that's existed, and it was pretty big. I don't know what's the best thing to me to compare it to size, but think of it as like five big Bibles put together, right? And so I ran a few ASICs. I bought a few ASICs, $60 each, power supplies, $100 each, hooked them all together, like eventually bought about six of them and started mining Bitcoin. And that led me to understand, at least how mining works, right? And that led me to understand how Bitcoin wallets work, because when you're mining, you need to have your own wallet. You want to keep your wallet secure. So that led me to understand how private keys work, right? And I already had, obviously being an engineer, I knew about private and public keys. So I found that story was starting to get more and more coherent. Anyway, so that's how I got into it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was my personal space. I did some projects on my space, tried to understand the code base more. It was all C++, so I felt good about it being C++. I've done a lot of C and C++ in my days, and the traditional. All right, so going back to my
Which,
history.
by the way, but most of our audience may not have even coded in C++ at this point. Just to age both.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I was a little excited about C++. And that brings me to what about C++? Like what about my history drew me to C++? So I started my career in a big bank. So I spent a lot of time in Goldman Sachs, traditional finance. We're talking about crypto, but my history starts with traditional finance. And that's when I was using a lot of C and C++ to build electronic trading systems. So that was another like slightly nerdy hook into the system, which is like, oh yeah, C++, I know it. Let me go find out more about it. And so where am I? Yeah. So after Goldman, a few different hops, and one of the more recent hops was a small company called Motif Investing, right? And what Motif did was something called thematic investing. So given a theme or idea or concept, how do you go from that to a balanced portfolio of stocks? But what's curious, what's more interesting is the thing that we wanted to do for our end users from a Motif's perspective was give them the ability to allocate a part of their portfolio in crypto, right? I'm hesitating to use like an inversely proportional asset. I won't
Yeah.
really say that because that has been proven not completely correct in the
Not
liquid,
yet.
not yet at least, right?
And by the way, just help orient us. What year was this that you guys were contemplating providing access to crypto? Because it seems natural now, but this was quite a while back.
Yeah. So 2014 was when I got into crypto. I started mining Bitcoin. Now, fast forward to about 2017, right? And we're talking about like early 2017. We're exploring like, should we give our end users, this is a retail application, along with an institutional side, our end users the ability to allocate some percentage of their portfolio in crypto, right? So this is around 2017. So a little bit around the time the 2017 boom, right? And that makes sense. Everybody's trying to ride the wave. So Motif also created like ETFs for traditional finance, right? So Motif had almost like I was able to see two aspects of like cutting edge innovation in fintech via crypto, but also traditional fintech via like ETFs and whatnot, right? And our institutional companies. So that's where I got a little closer to my professional life got a little closer to crypto, right? I met some of the founders, I like Bittrex founders, and some of the like BitGo from a custodial perspective, looking for liquidity providers, looking for custody providers, right? And one thing led to another. I found myself working for Coinbase. As you all know, Coinbase was started in 12, or as you might or might not, as your audience might or might not know, Coinbase started in 2012. And the one thing Coinbase did well was just provide access to crypto, right? Provide safe, secure, and easy access to crypto. And so around 2018, I ended up joining Coinbase. I led a few different functions within Coinbase. Initially, when I started, I was leading the exchange engineering, the backend exchange backend engineering. If you remember within the 2017 volume spikes, a lot of companies were struggling to keep up with the major spikes, as was the Coinbase exchange, right? So that was one of my first few challenges. Then I moved on to lead payments engineering. So moved from a very crypto-centric role to almost a not crypto-centric role, right? When you're leading payments engineering, you're dealing with extremely traditional institutions, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if I should name the institutions. Just to keep things safe. It's all public knowledge. I won't name them, but you can think about institutions across the globe: Japan, UK, the US, right? Banking institutions and traditional financial institutions that you're building payments rails across.
And just to put this in layman's terms for folks, essentially what we're enabling people to do is take money from the bank account or credit card and get it into Coinbase to go buy some Bitcoin. Is that roughly what this was enabling?
It is enabling you to move fiat money in or fiat money out and do whatever you want to do with that fiat money on on the platform,
Got
right?
it.
But that first aspect, move fiat money in, move fiat money out, that is primarily what the payments team is responsible for, right?
And getting those institutions comfortable with the money coming in and out of Coinbase. That's the real challenge, right? Because I think if people haven't done payments before, it seems like, oh, like there's an API, send a dollar comes in, that's all it is. What's so hard about that, right? But you want to tell us a little bit like why is this such a challenging problem? And folks who are in the payments industry will know this. So forgive us the little discretion, but it's worth outlining.
Oh, I love that question. It allows me to toot my own horn a little bit. So, an online merchant, an online non crypto merchant might find a lot of their payments needs met by an institution such as Stripe. You integrate with Stripe, you basically have access to global payment rails. Like you can, like within the first month of integrating with Stripe, I'm making up some numbers here, I'm making some assumptions. There are obviously exceptions. You could potentially be offering your products in to be traded via to be paid for via like the British pound, the Japanese yen, right? And so like there is a lot that happens behind the scenes, but as a traditional merchant, you usually don't have to deal with it. That's why the Coinbase payments team was in some ways very unique, right? And before I get into it, let me get into it, and then I'll draw the parallel. It's like 2018 was before the adoption of crypto in 2018 was very, very, very different than it is today. Right? And by adoption, I don't just mean the general public adoption. I also mean adoption by institutions, right? Like the MasterCards and the Visas, right? In 2018, almost no credit card provider wanted to transact with crypto merchants.
Yep.
Right? And that's for many different reasons. They have a specific risk appetite. They have many different regulatory and compliance needs that they must show, right, in terms of KYC, ML, etc. And that doesn't mean they can't do that with crypto merchants. It's just their risk appetite means that they're just going to take a slightly less risky stance.
Yeah.
Crypto is risky for me, right? I'm putting up air quotes now. You all can't see it, but that could be the general sentiment in 2018, right? So, which would mean a company like Coinbase, and a very legitimate company like Coinbase, right, is unable to work with companies like Stripe, right? Is unable to work with Amazon Pay, for example, right? And so that means you are building end-to-end integrations, end-to-end payments capabilities, all in-house, right? And as an engineer will tell you, building is one thing, maintaining is completely another, right? So when you're a small company, 2018, Coinbase was 500 people, right? When you're a small company, to be able to build global payment rails across multiple payments and across multiple different types of payment methods is an extremely complex task. It's a complex task in terms of partnerships. You still need to find those partners willing to partner with you, right? For example, ACH. You need to find an ACH partner who's on the ACH network, right?
Yep.
And for credit cards, you need to find you need to have Visa or MasterCard approve your membership, right? So you're basically rebuilding elements of Stripe in-house and doing it with like 10 people, 5 people.
Yes. Right? With, by the way, very skeptical partners. I mean, just for folks to kind of know why, what is KYC AML? Why is it important? All the governments around the world have agreed there's certain folks they don't want a lot of money going to. So people building nuclear weapons, people doing funding terrorist activities, they do not want money going to those places. And so a big way that they're able to regulate that is by ensuring all the financial institutions under their control abide by certain controls that they trust and more or less have some confidence that it makes it very, very difficult, although not impossible, for that money to flow outward. Where a lot of these financial institutions became very nervous and probably still are nervous is when you have the wild west of crypto, which really is the internet of money. It truly is this completely liquid network interfacing with this very stable, hundreds of years old financial infrastructure, and having that infrastructure and those governments understand that players within cryptocurrencies and Web3 like Coinbase are trustworthy. And so kind of, Arjun, you're saying that you and your team are really at the heart of building that connection between the wild west of crypto and these, centuries old institutions. I don't know how BNY Mellon is, but literally hundreds of years old institutions the governments have trusted to govern financial money flows for, the history of modern monetary systems.
Yes. In short, the answer to that question is yes. But also, like like you can pursue partnerships with, for instance, if you wanted to build out ACH rails, you could pursue a partnership with JP Chase, right? And that would be a very, very high quality partnership. Or you can pursue a partnership with a much, much smaller bank, but also within the ACH network, right? For many different reasons, you might want to go with JP Chase. For many different reasons, they might not want to partner with you, right? So our partnership stack looked like a varied mix of medium tier, lower tiered, and higher tiered partners, right? And tiers can be defined in terms of risk. Tiers can be defined in terms of assets under management. Tiers can be defined in terms of tenure of the company, etc. Right? Or the regulatory certificates or obligations that they're obliged by. Another point here is, the point that you brought up around like OFAC checks and things like that, right? That's also things we have to build in house, right? Like, that when you're using a payments provider has an obligation to weed out a minimum level of like bad actors. Right? They might not be able to make it efficient as your company might need it in terms of a payment, in terms of number of payments, but they will make sure that, if Iran is on the OFAC list as an example, right? And this is no commentary on any region or geography, right? Just giving you an example, then a payment will not come through because it is in the OFAC list, right? Yep. Now, but you have to go build this OFAC list yourself, right? You're building OFAC lists yourself. You're building risk monitoring software yourself. So you're doing a lot yourself, which becomes very, very difficult to do with, as you can imagine, with a small company. Anyway, to go back to your original question, that's what payments was for Coinbase. That's why it was very complex. And that was quite a big hurdle for us to overcome within the 2018, 2019 years.
Yeah, that's incredible, especially as it scales. And we're seeing that narrative play out further where you started, kind of your story really mirrors the evolution of the industry where you started in the most traditional finance. You moved over to a little bit more interesting, with motif liquidity plays and thematic investing, and started to get the everyday investor exposed a little bit to cryptocurrencies. You helped evolve really the heart of the centralized finance, revolution where there's a bridge, and I use that term very loosely, between the crypto world and the traditional finance world. And now I know we've had a lot of discussions around DeFi and kind of how this world is really opening up, where you're seeing, the 300 or so million cryptocurrency users, maybe 1% are starting to adopt DeFi. So maybe a way, I don't know if this is the correct analogy or not, but I almost think about it as, if the centralized exchanges are AOL, maybe we're entering the era of like truly open internet. And I don't know if that's you're laughing, which is good. I don't know if it's the apt analogy or not, but I'm curious to see what you think about, the convergence, divergence, really what's happening now that you've got a critical mass of users online and you start to see more diversified solutions, use cases, tools, and options.
Well, before I answer that, an important thing for your listeners to know is I am no longer employed with Coinbase, so my opinions are mine alone, right? And I am not a paid spokesperson for any of these institutions or companies that have been mentioned today. Now, I specifically said that because you said centralized exchanges might be AOL. I was like, okay, if I'm going to talk about this, I better grab that first. Centralized exchanges might be. So let's talk about DeFi for a second, right? And we were just touching upon this before we started the podcast, which is, like we can get into the basics of DeFi. We can get into how CeFi transitions to DeFi, etc. But like a quick point for me to a thought that has developed quite a bit in my head is, I don't see a world that's diverging, that's converging, right? And in fact, you pointed out we might actually see a world that's diverging, right? So it rarely becomes, in my mind, a question of CeFi versus DeFi, which is if you Google these terms, you will see that material all over the place. Is DeFi the solution to crypto, right? Our CeFi is gone, right? Is volumes are moving away from all centralized exchanges, etc. So you will see this narrative quite a bit, but that's not how I personally view this, right? And an example I'd like to pose is an impact in a very, very core component of DeFi, until now at least, have been stablecoins, right? USDC, USDT, algorithmic stablecoins and non-algorithmic stablecoins, right? But that's been a very, very important component of DeFi. Well, I'd love, I don't know if the common user knows how stablecoins actually work. Yes, they're meant to be pegged to a stable, quote unquote, stable entity, right? Yep. Given the current inflation rates, I don't know what is stable anymore.
But 6%, 1%, it's all the same, right?
Exactly, right? And so they're meant to be pegged, right? Let's put it there. They're meant to be pegged to something that the world perceives as stable, right? How does that pegging actually happen, though? Right? That pegging happens because there is a centralized entity at the very core of a stable coin, which is a bank, right? For USDC or any US dollar backed stable coin, for instance, there is an entity that is moving money out of, for just keeping it simple, out of a bank account into a bank account to burn stablecoin, to issue stablecoin, right? So like, one of the most core elements, or a core element of DeFi is a stable coin, but a core element of a stable coin is a centralized bank. So like, today there already aren't fundamentals that exist for DeFi to be completely DeFi, right?
Yeah.
Centralized finance, I don't see that, right? So that's why I don't think the world is going to converge on one solution or two. I do think the world is going to find better ways of crypto providing real value, right? Whether that's through CeFi, centralized finance, right? Traditionally, Coinbase would be classified, or elements of Coinbase would be classified as centralized finance, or DeFi, such as Uniswap and Curve Finance and whatnot, right? Yeah. Now going back to the question, is CeFi like AOL?
Yes.
Or can CeFi become like AOL? Yeah, that's a tough question for me to answer. But given that I strongly feel like DeFi cannot exist in a vacuum, I see that DeFi needing CeFi to CeFi as a substrate, right? Like CeFi for its own sustenance. It can either be like the lines between CeFi and traditional finance might get a little blurry, right? Which is traditional finance might evolve to get closer to CeFi, or CeFi might just delve back into traditional finance. For instance, like maybe Coinbase just becomes a completely regulated exchange like the Nasdaq, right? And
so that really goes all the way up market.
Correct, right? That would mean CeFi moving more towards the traditional finance,
or
maybe the opposite example, right? Like maybe Nasdaq starts, or we start better regulating the crypto industry, right? But in its own regulation, not the traditional regulation that has existed, right? So that might become CeFi finding its own. Right. So I don't have a great answer for you, but those are my thoughts that hopefully capture how I'm thinking about this area.
Yeah, it's a complex area and very much emerging. I mean, if you think about an adoption rate, even within crypto, which is already still kind of a bunch of early adopters mostly, this is the early adopters of the early adopters thinking about how this space is forming up. And I use the internet example. I think about, AOL and Yahoo, where there's a new transformative technology, the internet, being introduced to the broad population. And it necessitated a highly curated experience, as Coinbase offers. But we use Coinbase, we pick on them not because we think anything's wrong. We think actually I think, I'll say personally, one of the better companies in the industry, have done an amazing job to make it easy and provide this curated experience. What we've seen with the internet, though, is as the space evolves and the base technologies become more familiar, the need for that curated experience starts to fall away. And other players, the Googles of the world, the WhatsApp, Telegram, like different parts of these internet players start to provide these very niche functionalities, assuming that the base technologies of the internet are well understood and are passed on to players like, our local Comcast providers or AT&T. So you see kind of the old generation get commoditized and a new generation of players set up based on the current need. So where I'm going with this is, I wanted to get your thoughts on what are the big need drivers you see, assuming that all the things that CeFi offers will become commoditized or are done well now. So they're kind of off the table. What are the things that people are looking for in DeFi? Is it security? Is it self-custody? Is it cost? what do you see people really driving this revolution from a core user need sense? And then we can maybe peer into the future to figure out, where the space is going to go to meet those needs.
Yeah. Excuse me. So I'll answer your question a little roundabout.
Yeah.
Right. And so I was reading, I was trying to do some research before our podcast, and I came across this blog, right? And we can put the link to the blog in the episode description, right? And it talks about how an asset class evolves into becoming an asset class. And the reason I want to start the answer there is because one of the foundations of that is value and need. Right. And so maybe the question is more about crypto value and need and less about DeFi value and need, where DeFi is a mechanism to provide that value, to satisfy that need, and crypto is the one that has found a solution for that need. Right. So let me just read, and I'm just reading verbatim right now.
Yep.
So whenever something becomes useful for people, it becomes popular, right? And when something is popular, it has the potential to become an asset class. However, it is only when something becomes essential that it has achieved the status of an established asset class. Once a concept or object of value is indispensable, either to the survival or to the efficient functioning of society and the economy, people will pursue ownership, and the concept is embedded into the foundation of society and the economy, right? So, what that paragraph is trying to say is, we need to find an actual need, an actual value that is useful and embedded into the economy, into the communities, right? And that's where I think, and I'll be very, very transparent. As someone who's been in crypto since 2014, I think crypto is still lacking, right? And here's why also. I think the advantage of crypto is that it is extremely wide and extremely applicable. This wideness, this vastness also almost serves as a disadvantage because crypto has yet to find that value vertical and completely own it. Right. And we've seen a lot of examples like, oh yeah, crypto could do this. And here's an example of a company trying to do it. And crypto could do like, for instance, go back to 2014. Crypto was supposed to be like cross-border money transfer, remittance, etc. Right? Have we seen crypto own that yet? Not really. Just because when you start going that now, then I was like, oh, but crypto can also do this. Oh, but crypto can also not just be a vehicle for value, but it's a vehicle, period. The vehicle, you can transport anything on it. Right. So like that vastness has, in some ways, in my opinion at least, prevented crypto from owning some value verticals, which would then embed themselves into our communities, into our economies. And until that really starts happening, I think it'll be difficult for anyone to go up there and be like, crypto can do this, but yes, does it? Right. So I think that same thing applies, that same kind of argument applies to DeFi, where DeFi is just another arm of crypto. And then for DeFi to plug a need, to plug a hole, it really needs to own a need, own a hole. There are many such holes to be plugged, but let's go own one of them.
Yeah, right? That's a good point. I mean, we go all the way back to the beginning, and kind of what was, I thought, very impressive about the original white paper, just the painting the picture of a highly secure, transportable store of value. Like that at its super, super core. I mean, not even a currency, really a commodity. Really a commodity is what it laid out. Like, do you think DeFi is driving that? Because we see in DeFi, you mentioned stable coins, Uniswap, just the ability to interact and exchange currencies separate from reliance on major institutions, or at least permanent reliance on major institutions. Is that a need that you see filled at all right now, or do you see even that as kind of a casual provider of the Web3 space?
At the very top of the pyramid, where you're exchanging assets, right? I prefer not to call them currencies, but we're in exchanging assets.
Yep.
That fills that hole, yes. But when you go down that pyramid, it's like, what asset are you exchanging and how are you getting access to that asset?
Mm-hmm.
Right? When you go down that pyramid, what risks are you subject to? Right?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about asset risk,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, do you really understand the asset here? Right? Like USDC, right? There's a consortium. It's very centralized, right?
Yes.
Or pseudo-centralized, right? Like if that consortium was to spend everything that backs USDC, how would you know about it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You wouldn't. So like there is asset risk, there is contract risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when you're trading on these contracts, there is an assumption, and I made that assumption, and you corrected me, which is like I can see the code and thus it's secure,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not true, is it? Just because you see the code, just because the code is open source, doesn't make the code secure,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
That makes the code less, maybe it makes it less vulnerable, right? Because more people can improve the quality of the code, but does it actually make it secure? Probably not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's like another layer to the onion. Like maybe you call it a pyramid, maybe you call it an onion. That's another layer that you're peeling off,
Well,
right?
it's not a pyramid scheme.
So, yeah, maybe let's call it an onion and not a pyramid then.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that makes sense though. And we always talk about that, kind of going back to the core topic of the podcast of just this interplay of value and security and speed and security. It's always this give and take between those two of, crypto, even with its, use cases or not, expanding rapidly. And yet it does lack this core security. To your point, transparency is maybe a precursor to security. Like we're saying, hey, it's great that contracts are visible. We're not even hoping for them to be effectively risk scored and rated. So, hey, if I put my money in this store value, I know how it will behave and I know how I get my money in and out. But maybe that's where DeFi starts to emerge with a real use case, because it starts to address a little bit the security by providing more transparency. So I know more about, the way Uniswap works than the dark pool of any other centralized institution. And I know more about the storage of it if I have it on my, hardware wallet in my basement. I think it's fairly secure, and I know a lot about how that works versus, again, as we're seeing with all the contagion that, FTX has brought and Celsius recently, we don't really know whose assets are whose or under what laws they're regulated, or whether their debt or assets are owned by the company or owned by the user. So maybe we go all the way back to that centralized use case of providing this transportable, divisible, somewhat stable store value. DeFi is a way to take the original promise of crypto, of primarily Bitcoin, and strengthen it, right? Maybe it's building close to the point where it is universally usable, although I think we'll agree like maybe 10% of the way there, nowhere near all the way there. Do you think that's the driver of like why people are looking into DeFi more and more today?
Like Bitcoin, right? As an example, it is DeFi already, right? It is decentralized because anybody can participate into it. I became a miner, right? It cost me like what, $100 to become a miner, right? So it is decentralized. There isn't any centralized authority that can make unilateral actions. It's not happening, right? So DeFi has a few different meanings. Like at the start of this is DeFi. Start of crypto was 2008 and 2009 when the first blockchain was mined. That was DeFi,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like one Bitcoin, it was a perceived store of value, and someone sent it from someone to someone,
Mm-hmm.
right? So value was exchanged, right? So that was DeFi already. The DeFi we are talking about today just happens to be more different applications of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the DeFi that colloquially gets talked about is purely just yield farming.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of DeFi just like I wouldn't say it irks me, but it's like I want to tell people to get informed about it,
Yeah.
but then also I know it's very difficult to get informed about because it's complex,
Yes.
right? Just as is a credit default swap. I want to tell people to get informed. But
I don't even know if the bankers read the credit default swaps. I don't know if you've seen those legal contracts, but they're like phone books. So maybe that's as good of a place to end as any. I mean, it really is an expansive world out there, and I know we'll talk again because this evolving topic of DeFi is just growing in complexity as it finds its use case, as it finds, whether it's the next new thing in yield farming or coming back to the history of being a stable store of value. But Arjun, hey, I really appreciate you coming on, being the first guest. It was always a pleasure to talk to you, man. Thank you so much for coming on.
It'll be my pleasure. And anytime you want to talk about crypto or basketball or any of these topics, yeah, I'll be there. Just knock on my door.
We'll have you back anytime, man. Well, hey, everyone, thanks for joining us on the Crypto Guardians podcast and our first episode. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.